Well, for something to do, I've decided to jump onto the Wayback Machine with Mr. Peabody and Sherman and venture back to the year 1978 because I remember a restaurant in Fort Wayne, one of a couple of restaurants here in Fort Wayne that strike me as memorable. And I remember going to it, and maybe you do too if you're older than dirt. The restaurant was known as the Moonraker. Yep, may bring back some memories. The Moonraker was located over there in Coliseum and Parnell. I think there's a car wash there. It's right across the street from the Coliseum. But I believe, like I said, I think it's a car wash now. Like now, there's car washes everywhere in the city of Fort Wayne. But Moonraker was unique. It it had a couple of different levels to it. One level was called the Davy Jones Locker. It was downstairs. They had a guy playing the piano who I believe, and someone can correct me if I'm wrong, I think he was the guy who ended up playing the organ at the Coliseum. I think that was the same guy. Now, like I said, could be wrong, and someone will correct me if I am. But I want you to take a look at the menu and see what you could get when you went to the Moonraker, because those were one of the two premier restaurants to go to in Fort Wayne back in that era. The second one was on the southwest side of town on West Jefferson, over there near the Covington Shopping Center. It was called The Wharf. The cool thing about The Wharf was they had this great big giant fireplace. And if you were lucky, and you went on a date or took your wife or whatever, you got to sit by the fireplace. Very romantic, very cool. But the Moonraker was unique in that, well, it was a seafood restaurant. And take a look at some of this stuff. Yeah, it was nautical but nice was their theme. And you could get lobster and sirloin combination, lobster and sirloin for $8.75. You could get crab legs and sirloin combo for $7.75. And hell, how about this? A 6-ounce lobster tail was $6.75 back in 1978. Now, the captain's platter, you ever got that? It had the king crab, the mini beef bruschetta, the broiled haddock. It was only $7.25. That's what it cost back in those days. Now, shrimp cocktail, jumbo shrimp, $2.75. The Moonraker was, well, something interesting, something special, something unique, and it all came from the Azars. The Azar family back in that era owned a whole bunch of restaurants in Fort Wayne. You used to look at the Big Boy restaurant, it's all Azars. The Moonraker, the Wharf. There's so many other restaurants that you could name, but the Azars had their hands in everything. They had a commissary over there on Coliseum Boulevard by the Kmart, down there by the river. At St. Mary's. Kmart in that area was right next door to that. You had to know how to drive back there, but it's a big commissary where they stocked everything. Back in those days, they were competing against Don Hall of the Hall's restaurant. So you had the Hall's restaurant, and they had some nice restaurants. But the Azars, they had the Moonraker and the Wharf. All classic restaurants back in 1978. Now, you're saying, well, why was it so cheap back then and so expensive today? Well, it's simple, folks. You can't keep borrowing money in the United States Treasury. Now, I don't know how many trillions it was back in 1978, but I can guarantee you it wasn't the approximately $40 trillion that we are in debt today, much less back then. The problem is you will always have an increase in inflation. You will always have it. The problem is you will always have an increase of inflation when your money becomes worth less. It's plain and simple. Your money becomes worth less than it is today than it was tomorrow. That value of that money has gone down. You take a look at Venezuela, Maduro over there, not elected, by the way, but what he did, it was so bad, and their currency over there was so badly destroyed that people in Venezuela, if you wanted to buy something, you took a stack of money and they weighed it. And I'll give you two pounds of these dollars or whatever it was in Venezuela for a loaf of bread. That's when money becomes worthless. And the more that we spend and the more that we literally put onto the national debt, the less our money becomes, well, worth. And the biggest thing that hit our money was during the COVID era, because back in that era, the President Biden and his administration, on their funding act, Make America Better, whatever the heck they called it, dumped $2 trillion into our economy. $2 trillion. They just printed $2 trillion and sent it out to everybody. Y'all get money. The problem was all that money they put out there, the new money, this is not old money, this is new money they just created, made your dollar 20% worth less. 20% the value of your dollar went down because they stuck $2 trillion into the economy. And you wonder why suddenly the inflation shot up so much? When a dollar becomes worth 20% less than it was the day before, inflation's going to rise because a dollar ain't worth as much. That's what happened. That's why all the inflation happened. Everything shot up 20%. Everything shot up. Now, talking about the Moonraker, fabulous place in 1978. Today, those prices, you go out to a restaurant, you know how much it costs to go to a restaurant nowadays. Average meal today at a restaurant is $20. Back a few years ago, it was $12. It's inflation, folks. And that's what it is. That's what I know. And now, that's what you know.